Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we'll follow a rare calm morning until a single chilling message appears. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. The next morning felt like a continuation of the promise. Not a dramatic sunrise, not a sudden emergency, just soft light on the curtains and the quiet, ordinary sound of Yuri moving around the kitchen again, like he was building peace with his hands. One small routine at a time, Tu Tieu woke up on the couch with a blanket pulled up to her chin. For a second, she forgot where she was. Then she remembered. Mrs. Nghia, asleep in the bedroom, the warm milk from last night, the way Uri had kissed the top of her hair and whispered, "We promise." Yuri turned when he heard her and smiled immediately, as if he'd been waiting for her to open her eyes. Tu Tieu blinked a few times. Better than I expected. Yuri's eyes softened. I'm glad. He slid a mug across the counter toward her tea this time. Not coffee, with honey already mixed in. You remembered? Tu Tieu murmured. You like it like that. Tu Tieu wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the warmth sink in. The air in the room felt different today, less tight, like the walls had stopped listening for danger. From the bedroom, Mrs. Ghia's soft cough drifted out. Yuri instantly lowered the stove and walked toward the doorway with quiet care. Mum? He called gently. Mrs. Nghia appeared a moment later. Cardigan on, hair slightly messy, eyes still sleepy. When she saw Uri, her face softened the way it always did, relief mixed with a mother's constant worry. Only because I wanted to make breakfast. Mrs. Nghia glanced at Tu Tieu. Good morning, dear. Tu Tieu stood quickly. Good morning, Mrs. Nghia. Did you rest? Mrs. Nghia nodded. I did. Thank you. They ate together again, simple food, quiet conversation, no urgency hanging over the table. Yuri made sure his mother took her vitamins, and Tu Tieu gently organized the pills into a small container, like she'd done yesterday. It was ordinary, and that's what made it sacred. When the dishes were done, Yuri suggested something that made Tu Tieu pause. I want to take Mom to a doctor, he said calmly. Mrs. Nghia looked startled. Yuri, I'm fine. Yuri stepped closer, his voice gentle. I know you're strong, he said, but I want a checkup. Just to make sure your blood pressure is okay, your stress hasn't done anything hidden. That's a good idea. Mrs. Nghia hesitated. But what if someone recognizes me? Yuri's eyes stayed warm. We pick a clinic that's quiet, and we go like a normal family. No drama, no fear, just care. Nghia looked down at her hands. I hate that you have to think like this. Yuri reached for her hand. I don't hate it, he said softly, because it means you're here, and I get to protect you. Okay. Tu Tieu watched Uri how he never pushed with force, only with love. It made her chest ache in the best way. While Mrs. Nghia got ready, Tu Tieu cleaned the living room and folded blankets, trying to make the space feel more like a home. Uri returned from the bedroom holding a small envelope in his hand. Tu Tieu frowned. What's that? Uri's expression stayed calm, but his eyes narrowed a little. It was slipped under the door this morning. Tu Tieu's stomach dropped. A note? Uri nodded. No name, no return address. He didn't open it immediately. He held it like he was deciding whether it deserved to steal their peace. Mrs. Nghia stepped into the room and froze when she saw it. Uri. Uri moved closer to her right away. Mum, breathe, he said softly. It doesn't mean anything yet. Tu Tieu whispered. Do you want me to open it? Uri shook his head gently. Not you. He set the envelope on the table, took a slow breath, and opened it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper. No long letter, no dramatic threats, just a printed receipt, a pharmacy receipt. And one item circled in pen, blood pressure medication. Tu Tieu's heart sank. They're watching what she buys? Mrs. Nghia's face went pale. I didn't buy anything yesterday. Yuri stared at the receipt, calm but focused. Then they're trying to make us feel watched. Tu Tieu's voice shook. It worked! Yuri reached for her hand immediately, grounding her. Hey, he whispered, look at me. Tu Tieu forced herself to meet his eyes. This is what fear looks like when someone prints it out and slides it under a door. It's paper. It's not power. Mrs. Nghia's hands trembled. Yuri, I'm so tired of this. Yuri's voice softened. I know, Mom. He folded the receipt back into the envelope and slid it into a drawer. Today, he said quietly, we're still going to the doctor. Tu Tieu blinked. Even after this? Yuri nodded. Especially after this. We don't cancel life because someone wants to control it. Mrs. Nghia swallowed hard. What if that's what they want? For us to walk into something? Yuri shook his head gently. Then we don't walk into it blindly. We walk into it wisely. He grabbed his keys. We'll choose a clinic near people. In daylight. We'll park in front, and we'll go together. Thank you. They drove to a small clinic in a quiet shopping area. Bright windows, security cameras, normal people coming in and out. Yuri guided his mother slowly, one hand near her elbow without making her feel weak. Inside, the waiting room smelled like disinfectant and old magazines. Mrs. Nghia sat between Yuri and Tu Tieu like a protected treasure. Tu Tieu tried to relax, but her phone buzzed, unknown number. Her chest tightened instantly. Yuri noticed without her saying a word. He leaned slightly closer. Don't answer, he whispered, calm. Tu Tieu set the phone face down, hands shaking. Yuri's hand covered hers. Breathe, he said softly. In and out. Tu Tieu followed his rhythm. The phone buzzed again and again. Then it stopped. A message came through. Tu Tieu's throat went dry. Yuri tilted the phone toward himself and read it quietly. His expression didn't explode, but something in his eyes sharpened. He showed Tu Tieu. The message was short. Keep your promise. Last night's promise, he said softly. The one my mum asked for. Mrs. Nghia looked up, confused. What? Tu Tieu's lips trembled. Someone is... Yuri cut in gently, protecting his mother from panic. It's nothing you need to carry right now, Mom, he said softly. Just breathe. But Tu Tieu could see it in Uri's face. He wasn't angry, he was thinking. Because this message wasn't just a threat, it was proof that someone knew about that intimate moment. Which meant they weren't just being watched outside, they'd been listened to. Tu Tieu's eyes filled with fear. Yuri squeezed her hand. Steady. Not here, he whispered. We stay calm. We finish the appointment. Then we talk. Mrs. Nghia reached for Uri's hand. Uri, what is happening? Yuri smiled gently at his mother, soft, reassuring, almost heartbreakingly calm. Nothing you need to worry about right now, he said. Today is about your health. And then, as if the universe was giving them one more chance to choose peace, a nurse called Mrs. Nghyia's name. Uri stood, offering his mother his arm. Let's go, he said warmly. Tu Tieu followed behind, heart racing, trying to hold on to Uri's calm like it was a rope in deep water. Because whatever waited outside this clinic, Uri was determined not to let it steal their day. Mrs. Nghia's appointment went better than anyone expected. Her blood pressure was a little high, no surprise. After everything, but the doctor wasn't alarmed. He spoke gently. explained what stress can do to the body, and recommended rest, hydration, and a follow-up in 2 weeks. Yuri listened closely, asking calm, practical questions. Not because he was trying to control the situation, because he wanted his mother to feel like someone competent was holding the edge of the world steady. When they left the exam room, Mrs. Nghia looked lighter, still tired, still cautious, but less afraid of her own heartbeat. Yuri held the clinic door open for her. "Proud of you," he whispered. Mrs. Nghia gave him a small smile. "You always say that like I'm a kid." Yuri smiled back. "Because you're my mum." Tu Tieu felt her throat tighten. It was such a simple line, but it carried everything. You're not alone. You're not a burden. You're mine to care for. They walked to the car slowly. The sun warmed their shoulders, and for a few minutes, Tu Tieu almost let herself believe they were just a normal family running errands. Almost. Nghia settled into the back seat and clicked her seatbelt. Uri turned slightly toward Tu Tieu in the front passenger seat. His voice stayed gentle, but his eyes were serious. "Show me the message again," he said quietly. Tu Tieu unlocked her phone with trembling fingers and handed it over. Yuri read it once, then set the phone down like he didn't want the words living between them. "Keep your promise," he repeated softly. "They're trying to poison something pure." Tu Tieu's eyes filled. "How would they even know what your mom said last night?" Uri didn't answer with a wild guess. He answered with a plan. "We go home," he said calmly. "We keep mom comfortable. Then we talk privately." The drive back was quiet, but not cold. Yuri kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting lightly on the console, close enough that if Tu Tieu needed it, she could reach for him. And she did, once, just for a second. He squeezed her fingers back without looking away from the road, like he was saying, "I've got you." Back at the house, Yuri moved with purpose that still felt gentle. He made sure Mrs. Nghia had tea, a blanket, her medication within reach, and a calm TV channel playing low. He adjusted the pillow behind her back the way he used to when she had headaches. "Better?" he asked softly. Mrs. Nghia nodded. "Better." Yuri crouched beside her chair again, taking her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Mum," he said, "you did really well today. I want you to rest." Nghia frowned. "Is something wrong?" Yuri smiled, gently, steady, loving. "Nothing you need to carry, Mrs." Nghia searched his face for cracks, but Yuri didn't give her any. Finally, she nodded. "Okay. But come back soon." Yuri kissed her forehead. "Always." In the kitchen, the moment the door closed, Tu Tieu's composure broke. "What if they bugged the room?" she whispered, voice shaking. "What if they can hear everything?" Yuri stepped closer and took her hands immediately. "Hey," he murmured. "We're not going to spiral." Tu Tieu's tears spilled fast. "Yuri, they knew what your mom said. That was private. That was ours." "I know," Yuri whispered. His voice carried more sorrow than anger. He pulled her into a careful hug, slow, protective, like he was giving her permission to fall apart while he stayed steady. "I'm sorry," he said into her hair. "You didn't deserve that." Tu Tieu's voice cracked. "I feel like nothing is safe, like even kindness can be used against us." Yuri pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes were warm, not rushed, not impatient. "Then we rebuild safety," he said softly. "Not by pretending the fear isn't real, by choosing what we let it touch." Tu Tieu blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means we stop feeding it," Uri said gently. "We assume someone listened, so we tighten privacy. No big conversations in that space. No phones near the living room at night. We get a professional sweep, someone who knows what they're doing. We document everything. Screenshots, Timestamps, receipts. Tu Tieu nodded quickly, wiping her cheeks. Okay, Yuri added. And we don't let them twist our promise. Tu Tieu's lips trembled. They used your mum's words. Yuri lifted his hands to her cheeks, tender, grounding. Our promise was love, he whispered. No one can steal love with a text message. Tu Tieu let out a shaky breath. I'm scared I'll start flinching every time my phone lights up. Yuri nodded like he understood that kind of fear. Then we change the rules, he said softly. Phones stay off during meals. Nights stay quiet. And if it buzzes, you don't face it alone. I'll be right here. Tu Tieu's tears kept coming, but her breathing started to slow. Uri didn't try to fix her emotions. He simply stayed present, steady, kind. When she was calmer, Yuri spoke again, careful and quiet. I want to ask Mum something, he said. Tu Tieu blinked. What? Yuri glanced toward the living room. If there's anyone from her past who might have known where she hides, or anyone who asked questions. Tu Tieu's stomach tightened. You think it's personal? Yuri nodded slightly. Or close enough to hear things. They returned to the living room as if nothing was wrong. Yuri sat beside Mrs. Nghia, and Tu Tieu took the seat across from her, soft and supportive. Mrs. Nghia looked up immediately. You're back. Yuri smiled warmly. We're back. He took her hand. Mum, can I ask you something? She nodded. Of course. Yuri kept his tone light, not alarming. Before you disappeared, did anyone unusual contact you? A neighbor? An old acquaintance? Anyone asking questions? Mrs. Nghia's face tightened as she searched her memory. Not a neighbor, she whispered. But a woman from my past called me. Tu Tieu's breath caught. Who? Mrs. Nghia hesitated, then said quietly, Miss Carol. Carol? Your old friend? Mrs. Nghia nodded. She said she heard I was having trouble. She said she wanted to help. Tu Tieu felt cold creep up her arms. Did you meet her? No, Mrs. Nghia said. Only a call. But she knew details. About Yuri's work. About the company. Yuri's voice stayed gentle, but his eyes sharpened. Mum, how would she know that? Mrs. Nghia shook her head. I don't know, I thought. Maybe she heard it from others. She swallowed, and her voice got smaller. She also said something strange. She said, no matter what happens, don't trust the people who sound calm. Tu Tieu's blood ran cold, because the man in the baseball cap had sounded calm, too calm. Yuri didn't let that fear spill into his mother's face. He simply squeezed her hand and smiled softly. Thank you for telling me, he said gently. That's enough for today. He stood and poured Mrs. Nghia more tea, deliberately normal. Then he brought her a small plate, 2 cookies from a box Tu Tieu had bought the day before. Mrs. Nghia blinked at the cookies. Are you bribing me? Yuri smiled. Maybe. Mrs. Nghia's mouth twitched almost a laugh. It's working. That tiny moment mattered. It gave the room air. Later, Uri suggested something simple. A short gratitude ritual, just like Tu Tieu had once mentioned in passing. 3 things, he said gently, sitting with them. Nothing big. Now? Tu Tieu smiled softly. Just try. Uri went first. I'm grateful Mum is here. I'm grateful Tu Tieu stayed. And I'm grateful we had one peaceful breakfast. Tu Tieu's eyes watered. She swallowed. I'm grateful you're gentle, she said, looking at Yuri. I'm grateful Mrs. Nghia is safe today. And I'm grateful we laughed yesterday. Mrs. Nghia stared at them, eyes shining. "I'm grateful I'm not alone," she whispered. "I'm grateful for your hands holding mine. And I'm grateful I can sleep without jumping at every sound." Yuri reached over and kissed her forehead again. "You can." That night, Yuri made dinner even simpler than yesterday. Comfort food, warm tea, soft music in the background. Afterward, he helped his mother to bed, and when she was settled, he left the door slightly open, the way some mothers like when they're scared but don't want to admit it. Then Yuri returned to the living room, where Tu Tieu sat, curled on the couch, still holding the weight of that message. Yuri sat beside her and gently took her hand. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we do the practical things. We verify Carol. We arrange the sweep. We keep it legal and quiet." Tutu nodded. "And tonight?" Yuri's gaze softened, warm and certain. "Tonight we keep our promise." Tu Tieu's eyes filled again. "Even if they're listening?" Yuri shook his head gently. "Especially then. Because love isn't a secret they get to steal. Love is a choice we keep making." Tu Tieu leaned into him, and Yuri kissed the top of her hair, slow, careful, like he was placing peace back where fear had tried to sit. And for one more night, the house stayed gentle, because Yuri refused to let anything else become the loudest voice in it. Yuri tries to protect a warm, healing day for Tu Tieu and Mrs. Nghia by keeping life normal, breakfast together, gentle care, and a simple plan to take Mrs. Nghia to a quiet clinic for a checkup. But peace is shaken when an envelope appears, and Tu Tieu's phone lights up with an unknown message. "Keep your promise." Nghia shared the night before. Yuri stays calm, comforts Tu Tieu, and refuses to let fear control their day. After the appointment, he keeps Mrs. Nghia resting and talks privately with Tu Tieu about tightening privacy and documenting everything. Yuri then gently questions his mother about anyone from her past, and Mrs. Nghia reveals a surprising caller. Miss Carol, an old acquaintance who knew odd details and warned her not to trust people who sound calm.